So I just want to introduce Roy Copeland, who is going to talk about 18th century agriculture in Ireland, local aspects. So I'll hand over to Roy.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, agriculture in the 1700s. Just a couple, where did I put that? A couple of things first. One, through this talk, I'll be referring to Arthur Young, this gentleman here. He's an Englishman who toured Ireland at the end of the 1770s. Made many observations about Ireland, including around here. And you can read his book online, access it. So an idle moment or two, it's worth having a look. But it's a long read, so it'll occupy you for quite a while. Anyway, before I go any further, I think I talk about agriculture. I'd better talk a bit about background. I mean, Ireland in 1700 was coming out of a century, top, middle and tail by warfare and rebellion, which had a big impact. Certainly the rebellion of 41 and Cromwell's activities thereafter reduced the population, and it's said that much of the countryside, or many parts of it, were bereft of people, and therefore livestock roamed wild and all that sort of thing, sheep, cattle. And at that time, you're talking about pre the Act of Union, so Ireland was a colony in the British Empire. It had a parliament actually, but by a law of 1486, Poyntzpass law, anything that Parliament proposed had first to be ratified by the Privy Council in London and the Parliament. So really it just was subservient. The Church of Ireland was the established church, and to be any sort of a functionary in the establishment in Dublin, you had to be Church of Ireland. As I say, plantation was finished, or meant, and Ulster was largely Presbyterian, but Presbyterians were totally excluded, as I say, from any participation in government. It was only the established church that could do anything there. So that gives you a little bit of background. There is a book called 2 Centuries of Life in County Down, 1600 to 1800, and in it you will find, as I say, this description of the classes of society. The aristocracy and gentry, losing touch with the common people, dealing with the outer world through agents, owned most of the land, but many were absentee landlords. The established church clergy, too ready to assume, rather offensively, a position of superiority. The Presbyterian ministers, plain living and hard work, but look at doctrine through new life spectacles. Does that mean you must be born again? Was active even then? I don't know. There was a manufacturing class rapidly expanding, mainly with linen production. The small traders, sharp and intelligent, flourished more towards the end of the century. But then there's a group of farmers, bigger farmers, 2 to 100 acres. Comments about them interesting. Narrow in their interests. They have little idea of loveliness in their living, and none whatsoever of sanitation in their dwellings. Likely to have rented the land from the aristocracy and sublet all or part of it. And below them was the small cultivators of a few acres. Those who worked linen are the better off. Others are at subsistence level. And the bottom of the social ladder was the itinerant land labouring class, the cotters. Know little of the comforts or even the decencies of life. Live in outbuildings or hovels, which in those days were called cabins. Now, who were the local landlords in this area then, just then? Well, you had the Acton estate, and it's owned through the 1700s principally by the Stuart family, because the last of the Poyntzpass died in 1707. But the only other thing I could find out about the Stuart family when I started to trawl about what they might have grown or anything like that, was that they're on the British Legacies of Slavery website because they owned a plantation in Jamaica in the mid-1700s. Drummonagher was entirely owned through the century by the Moore family. The last of the Moores, as I say, went bankrupt about 1800, and then it went, as I say, to the Close family after that. So the Moore family owned it through it. Drummondtown, or as it was called then, the Manor of Glen. It would seem actually at the very start of the century it was owned by Hans Hamilton of Hamilton's Bawn. But I know that one Helen Delahunty says at the beginning of the century it was owned by Art McGuinness. I don't know. Hamilton was supposed to have bought it off the given it when the McGuinnesses fell foul of one rebellion or another. But I'm not sure there. Anyway, definitely from 1744, the Innes family owned it. So the second half of the century, they owned it. The four town lands there, well, they were forfeited by Lord Ivey and McGuinness way back after the 1641 rebellion, and they went into the Hawkins family, were handed to them, and come the 1700s, the person owned was Robert Hawkins McGill. McGill was married there. That's McGill of Gill Hall in Lurgan. But no, Dromore, well, whatever it, between the two. Sorry. In 1765, his daughter married the Earl of Clanwilliam, and from then on, the Clanwilliam family owned it. Lochadan, listen to Brig. I'm happy to be told exactly who owned it. I'm not sure. Some suggestion the Duke of Manchester. Anyway, I'll be grateful for information there. Unfortunately, and for all of those with very little information about, their agricultural systems, the closest we can get really is the Manor of Glen, where Arthur Innes in 1805, as I say, did a map of his estate and listed the names of most of his tenants. I haven't listed them. I will tell you there was two Copelands in it, Hugh and John. And whether one of those is a distant ancestor, I don't know, possibly. Because Hugh and John were names that came down the line, certainly my line anyway. So, but going back to the classes of society, the top classes down to manufacturing class, aristocracy, gentry, church, ministers, manufacturing class, and probably the farmers were 200 to 100 or 20 to 100. They were all Protestant. Once you got down to the cultivators of a few acres, probably around here it would be maybe half and half. But the bottom class was Roman Catholic, over 90% Catholic. Why? It's the effects of the penal laws. The Catholics were not allowed to own property. If anything they might own on their death had to be subdivided among all their children. They weren't allowed to educate their children. So they ended up, as I say, largely an illiterate class who were at the bottom of society and lived by working for the two groups of society above them. They were really people living hand to mouth. I quote here from what Edward Wills, Chief Baron of the Exchequer of Ireland, wrote in 1759 when he was on his way between Castlewellan and Hilltown. He had a comment about the lawlessness of the Mourne Mountains, which in the previous century he said was a no-go area because of the number of outlaws who lived in it. But as I say, looking at the hillside somewhere between Castlewellan and Hilltown, the cabin one sees on the side of the hill are the most miserable huts I ever saw, built with sods and turf, no chimney, the doors made with a hurdle. The smoke goes all out the door. The cocks and hens, pigs, goats, and if perchance they have a cow, inhabit the same dwelling. They seem upon a rank with American savages, except that they have some notion of making the sign of the cross and stand much in awe of their priests. And yet there must be times when manager and mistress of the family are merry and jolly, for the cabin doors are crowded with little naked boys and girls. So the dwelling arrangements were quite intimate, and accordingly the dining arrangements were equally intimate. Mark the Irishman's potato bowl placed on the floor, the whole family on their hams around it, devouring a quantity almost incredible. The beggar seating himself to it with a welcome. The pig taking his share as readily as the wife. The cock, hens, turkeys, geese, the cur, the cat, and perhaps the cow, all partaking of the same dish. So that gives you a flavour. To say, you see that picture there of a hovel a century later, but that's probably a mansion to what the cotters in the 1700s were living in. And certainly I know when Arthur Young went to Kerry, he was appalled at the poverty and the state of the cotters there. But if I show you a market report from a Dublin newspaper in 1709, you would say agriculture was exactly the same then as it is now. Look, the crops are the same, the livestock's the same. Wheat, oats, grey peas, I don't know what exactly, barley, butter, cheese, bacon, wool, bullocks, wethers and lambs. As I say, in the end of the 1600s, through the 1600s, Ireland had developed a really good market in England, as I say, both for wool and for livestock. It was shipping a lot of live cattle across to England, and its wool trade was important. Apparently in the 1600s, Irish wool was about the best in Europe. There was a great cottage industry spinning wool, weaving wool and cloth and selling it outside the island, not just to say to England, but also to the continent and even out to the West Indies and America. Yes, shearing then might look a bit like that there, although that's a century later. But if you go back right even to the 1630s, the wool merchants in England were griping about the Irish imports of cloth undercutting them. And then the landowners started griping that all these cattle coming in at a very competitive price were meaning, as I say, that they couldn't put the rents up for their farmers and was undercutting it. So towards the end of the century, England enacted a series of laws that really crippled Irish agriculture. England's view was, look, Ireland's a colony. We have one rule. None of our colonies should have an economy that in any way threatens the English economy. Therefore, it took the action, as I say, to stop the import of wool and cloth and to ban the import of live cattle, pigs, sheep, their meat, butter and cheese. That, as I say, crippled Ireland's agriculture. And clearly they had to do something else. They were limited really to the export of raw wool or to spun thread, to salted beef, salted pork, and butter and barrels, as I say. Whereas those could go to other countries, they couldn't go to England. They were banned out of England until 1758. As I say, the exception was the linen and hemp, because England really didn't have a flax and linen industry. The wool trade, as I say, was taxed and all that as well, and you could only export it through a specified port to a specified port in England. And as you can see by that statement there out of a newspaper in 1705, it all went under Navy escort across from Ireland to England. Why was that? Well, If you remember, that market report quoted the price of wool at 4 to 5 pence a pound. In France, you could get 2 and 6pence, half a crown for your pound of wool. So of course, all it did was span a smuggling industry. And I would say the 19 ships there were under convoy because if they hadn't been under convoy, at least 18 of them would have headed to France. But it did spawn a big smuggling industry. And as I say, created an industry that still exists in Ireland today, doesn't it? But the linen, I came across that there. I don't know whether or not the act was actually enacted, but certainly as a stop, because it had crippled the livestock industry, the English Parliament promoted growth of flax and the linen industry in Ireland. And hemp as well. Hemp was used for sailcloth, but although it was tried for pottered along for about first 20 years or so in the 1700s, it died out completely. Fortunately for Ireland, at about the same time, this gentleman, Louis Crommelin, a Huguenot who had been expelled from France in the 1780s, and then went to Holland and learnt a lot about flax and linen. He came to Lisburn now. It's not clear whether or not that was of his own volition or he was enticed to Lisburn or what, but anyway, he arrived there about 1700 and started to develop flax, show the local people how to grow flax, how to bleach it and create bleaching grains for bleaching. And he promoted flax. There's a book he wrote, published 1705, and he helped to foster the establishment of an Irish Linen Board in 1710. The value of the board was it started to apply a set of quality standards, and it persuaded the Irish Parliament and, of course, the English Parliament as well to legalise the standards, so that you had to dress the flax and everything and do it according to the book. And that put a bottom in the industry and a sense of quality and allowed trading to go on. The industry was a cottage industry. Everybody was doing all stages of the process, from growing, retting, scotching, hackling, whatever, all beetling and producing at the very least, as I say, raw wool or flax, raw linen cloth. And whereas at the start of the century, flax was probably evenly spread right across the whole of Ireland. And it had been, so it'd been grown for many centuries before 1700. It was well established in Ireland. Through the century, as I say, it came to centre around here, between here, Belfast. Those 4 counties there, Armagh, Antrim, Tyrone and Down. And Lurgan was the biggest market of the lot. You see there, 1784, the weekly sales in Lurgan, £2,600. And all those sales you see there were cash sales. You couldn't even buy it with paper money. It had to be coin. So there was a lot of coins floating about at that time. As I say, yes, it drifts north through the century until it's entirely really an Ulster crop. Around here we know that flax was very important through that century, because I know in the 4 towns every farm has a flax dam, at least one for flax dam, and I presume it's the same on the County Armagh side of the canal. And even it remained, as I say, a cottage industry, a lot of it through the century. I just found that interesting statistic in the Irish parish, Donaldsmore, that book by J.D. Cowan, which was published about 1900. But he said in the 3 townlands around Glen Chapel in 1821, there were 96 linen spinners and 43 weavers. So it was local. It would have been all this area around here would have been in linen, and that produced the bottom of the economy. It was a money crop, exported. It didn't, as I say, change in mechanization through the century very much. I suppose the first bit of mechanization was the scutcheon mills and beetling mills coming in, water-driven. I mean, there were two scutcheon mills in the river above Glenchapel, and I'm sure there are many more around the countryside here. You could probably name a lot of them. But that was the only sort of bit of mechanization in the industry until, I say, this gentleman, John Barber Jr., appeared. He was a Scotsman, to say. You saw linen was, what was it? Linen export out of Scotland or into Ireland was prohibited. That act I showed you earlier. Scotland was the only part of the British Isles that grew flax. I was probably centred around Paisley, south of Glasgow, which was a big weaving and fabric producing area. Barber family got into linen then sometime earlier in the 1700s. But whereas they maybe started weaving and everything, slowly over the next 50 years, they specialised in spinning and producing thread. And when they wanted to expand their thread making business in the 1780s, they decided to go to Ireland to do it because most of the time, the last 20, 30 years, they'd only bought Irish linen. It was better than the Scottish linen. So superior, as I say, they used nothing else. So about 1780s, John Barber came to Lisburn, set up somewhere south. It says southeast, a mile southeast of Lisburn. That must be about Rivarnet somewhere. And then they made that first spinning mill at Hildon at the beginning of the 1800s. And you know the score after that. The Hildon Mill, which opened in 1823, closed in 2006. So that, as I say, was the only bit of the whole linen industry that was sort of mechanized in the 1700s. Now, the big linen exporting ports, of course, were in the north then. Belfast, Londonderry, Newry, Coleraine. Dublin is there because apparently, certainly at the start of the century and first half of it, you could sell brown linen. You remember those markets there, which is unbleached linen. You could sell it through any port. But if you bleached linen, it had to go to Dublin to be sold. Eventually, Ulster reacted against that, established its own white linen market in Belfast, a white linen hall. That's the city hall now, isn't it? And the legacy we have of that time still is the Linen Hall Library, but by. I said, Newry was an exporting port. And if you go into Newry Library, you can actually find bills of loading from 1770s, showing ships loading packs of linen cloth for transport into England or to America. Here's one from Newry Port to Philadelphia. And on the way back, they brought flaxseed, 25 hogshead and 50 hogshead of flaxseed from the River Delaware, which runs through Philadelphia. That trade back and forth across the Atlantic had a byproduct as well, because in the 1700s, the only emigration really was Presbyterians leaving, the bulk of whom left Ulster. There was a bout in the 1720s where, because of bad harvests and all, but after the 1750s there was more, and this transatlantic trade facilitated the boats. They went on these boats. Why did they go? I'm not sure. I saw one report that blaming Presbyterian ministers and married women for the emigration. They said there was a number of Presbyterian ministers going around preaching the virtues of God's appointed land in New England. As I say, the emigration was either to the eastern seaboard of America or to Canada, the eastern seaboard of Canada. That's where they went to. It was said, as I say, that the married women were most receptive to the spiel because those with daughters were thinking there'd be a prospect of a better husband for the daughters. Those without daughters just thought, might be a better husband. Whether or not that's all right, I don't know. I'll pass. In the flax growing area, I was surprised to find that flax needs a long rotation, at least 7 years. So at the intervening years, people tended to grow oats or else have a few years fallow or lay. But they always planted the flax after potatoes. I can guess that that's because flax, being a small seed, would be very prone to being overcome by weeds, the weed seeds. And therefore, the way to do it was to grow the potatoes, which had a twofold benefit. One, it killed a lot of the weeds, it smothered the weeds and helped to reduce the weed burden in the soil. And two, the deep rooting and all that of the potatoes made the tilth in the soil a lot better and helped you to prepare a much nicer, finer tilth for growing the flaxseed. But it was followed by oats, and oats were their principal cereal crop grown, and then fallow or lay. But Arthur Young had a rather jaundiced view of the quality of the cereal growing around this area here when he came to County Armagh. I quote, "View the north of Ireland. It is there you behold a whole province peopled by weavers. It is they who cultivate and beggar the soil as well as work the looms. Agriculture there is in ruins. It is cut up by the root, extirpated, annihilated. The whole region is the disgrace of the kingdom. All the crops you see are nothing but filth and weeds. No other part of Ireland can exhibit the soil in such a state of poverty and desolation. The cause of all these evils is the linen fabric spreading all over the country, instead of being confined to towns." You see, the point was made because hand weaving and tillage farming were basically incompatible. It was manual work to do the tillage, heavy manual work. Rough, calloused hands snagged the cloth. Fingers thickened from manual labour were too clumsy to work the loom. So clearly, if you were heavily into weaving, spinning, and growing flax, as I say, you couldn't do the correct husbandry for your oat crops. And the spinning was more important. Sometime in that 1700's, I read that at a time when a stone of flax was worth 2 and 6pence, an ounce of the finest yarn, thread, was worth £4. You know, so there was a big premium on getting the quality in the spinning and the weaving. But what about, as I say, a word or two about the actually husbandry practices and how they grew stuff at the time? Well, you find, first of all, the animals were a lot smaller than they are now. So these where you see a photograph is obviously a century later, you know, the end of the 1800s or so, but it illustrates the equipment that would have been there in, as I say, the 1700s. The slipe there with soil or dung, they knew the value of dung, and they also prized the value of lime at the time, considering it to be equal to a fertilizer or to dung, because it sweetened the ground so much and improved yield so much. The cultivation, and here we have, as I say, the Ivan McGaws of the 1700s. It was spade work. An awful lot of it was spade work. And these guys, that says 18, 14, 24, but those guys would have been there through the whole of the 1700s as well. Note the shape of their spades and the shape of spade I have here today, because the shape of the spade differed across Ireland. This is Aston Evans' Folk Tales of Ireland or something, but he said the spade with the crossbar at the top was a North of Ireland thing. The spade without it was a Southern Ireland one. The other point he made, and this one, do you know the old story or the thing about which foot do you dig with? Well, he said the guys, as I say, with the single, always dug for the right foot. And that's true if you look at those. But he said, on a cross-handled spade, the man's holding it, as I say, in his right hand, and he's pressing it in with his left hand. So, does this mean then that this style of spade came in with a plantation, with the planters? And the other style, as I say, was a native Irish one. And that's why, that phrase about which foot do you dig with took root. I don't know. I'm making a guess on that one. How much of cultivation was done with a spade and how much with a plough? It's very hard to know. The ploughs in the 1700s were very, very simple, principally wood, almost always. The light Irish plough, as I talked about, said you could carry it over your shoulder. So there wasn't a lot of weight in it. It would only have been used to cultivate ground such as potato ground that already had a good tilth on it. If you were ploughing out a lay ground, you had to cross plough that way and then start and plough that way, which took a lot of work. And half an acre a day, I saw, was what they estimated could be done with cross ploughing. Of course, what was pulling it was supposed to be either cattle or horses. But again, animals were smaller. Talk about a milk cow in the 1700s only weighing 500 to 600 weight. So therefore it took either four or six cattle to pull a plough. And similarly really for horses, because they again were smaller in size and a lot lighter. I reckon ploughing, if it was done, it was the larger farmers who done it because you needed so many animals to do it. The small farmers on 4 or 5 acres simply could not afford to keep a horse. As I said, would have eaten too much grass at the time. And the Scottish swing plough, as we know it, the forerunner of all the ploughs that we see today, with the curved moldboard that actually turned the furrow right over and let it down almost flat again. James Small only invented that in 1780s, and it didn't come into Ireland until the very end of the century, the beginning of the 1800s. I know from the previous talk I did about the ploughing match, a commentator made the statement that around Glen, and there were only 7 ploughs, I think in 1820, or 1810, 1820, whereas 20 years later there were 70. So really the ploughing came in when that one there came to Ireland, and you only needed 2 horses to work it, and 1 man can work it. The old plough there, it took 1 man holding it, another man pressing down on the beam to keep it in the ground, and a 3rd man or 4th man to steer the 4 animals pulling it. After the ploughing, of course, cultivation, a lot of it must have been simply by hand. I mean, these obviously are horse-drawn implements here, but where it was dug by spade, I suspect a lot of it was hand-held rakes doing the harrowing. Initially, certainly, the rakes, they said, were pulled in line, so this bit up the middle wasn't cultivated, and then they moved on, as I say, to the offset rakes. The sowing of the seed would have been as that there, showing you out of a half bag or the equivalent on, say, the hung over the shoulder. I don't even know whether or not the corn fiddle was in existence in the 1700s. The cultivation of the crop, or the husbandry of the crop, I should say, looking after it, clearly around this area wasn't done very much, according to Arthur Young, but I was pleased to see that this thistle puller, which has hung up on the shed at the house for many decades, generations, as I say, is of the Armagh type there, as you can see. And I hope that those of you who saw the likes of this in action in your childhood realise that you're the last people that will ever have seen a thistle puller at work. Because I remember my father going through a field of corn or barley, pulling the thistles with it. Harvesting in those days, it was, in theory, as I say, either with a scythe or with the sickle. But it looks as though around here it probably was all by the sickle. This is a smooth-bladed one, which would have been used for cutting grass. The ones for corn, they said, were notched. But there's very little reference to people using a scythe, even though a scythe apparently has been around since Roman times or such. The only reference I can get is further down south. There used to be the Connaught men from Connaught migrated across to Leinster, to the east coast, in August and September. They were scythesmen called spalpeens, and they set out would cut the crops in the east of Ireland. It was said a good man could mow 2 acres a day. That was the sort of standard, or an average man, I suppose, 2 acres a day. A good man could do 4 acres. So Frank, do you remember that story from the old road about the field being mowed and then walking to the hill of Tara? Maybe a lot of truth in it. Threshing the grain was either this way, just knock it over a stone, or alternatively use the flail with the joint in the middle. Those were the two ways, seemingly. It seems that you used this method, you used this method here if you wanted the straw for thatching. The potatoes, as I say, certainly by the 1700s, I would have said they spread out across all of Ireland. And through the century then, they were grown and became absolutely dominant as the foodstuff for the cotters, for the bottom classes of society. It's interesting to notice that on that market report I showed you earlier on, potatoes wasn't mentioned at all. I think even through most of the 1700s, they were simply just the foodstuff crop, grown to supply your family's need. And maybe it was only at the end of the century that they began to develop an export trade to the cities in the west of England. Again, principally grown in ridges, though in lazy beds, possibly grown in drills to some extent. But another thing I found out interesting about the agriculture was that the native Irish, had no tradition of ever making hay. It didn't occur to because in the summertime they moved their livestock to the upper lands, to the Bully land. And for example, the Deer's Meadow where the Spelgas was supposed to be a Bully land. Common grazing on the upper lands, stay there through the summer, send one of the kids or 2 or 3 of the kids to look after all the livestock. The adults stayed at home. They would have done whatever cultivation of vegetables, potatoes, oats, or whatever they needed to say at the home place, bring the livestock back in the autumn time, and it was common grazing on all the cereal fields and whatever else existed then, as I say, to keep the livestock going over the winter. No tradition of saving hay, fodder for winter time. That's an import from the planters, the English planters that came into Ireland initially through in the Pale area, and I presume the Scots and the Presbyterians brought it as well. Now, in Ireland, a couple of points about this, the population. It actually doubled through the century, from about 2.5 million to about 5 million. But really, at the end of the day, most of that occurred, as I say, in the second half of the century, because in 1840, you had a severe famine. One where the number of dead probably proportionately was just as great as the famine a century later. But a few days after Christmas in 1839, the frost set in. Really, really severe frost. It seems about the same level as we had in 2010 December, where it was, minus 13 centigrade or so. That set in just after Christmas and lasted 6 weeks. It did a lot of damage to the potato crops. It would seem that one of the storages we know it in bins or that sort of thing was not common. And it would have been left in the drill and dug as needed. And of course, those frosts wiped out the potato crop totally, whatever was there for eating, which is bad enough, probably because the potatoes were lost, then they had to eat their oats, and therefore had reduced the amount to sow and plant for the following year. Not only that, 1740, the northeast and east winds blew all springtime. It was a dry, cold spring. Soil was very dry at planting time and was a cold summer. So the harvest at the end of the summer was abysmal. Those factors combined meant that in the winter of 1740-41, there was a tremendous number of deaths through starvation and sickness. That map that shows you there is really the change in population over the 10-year period, 32 to 44. Red shows there was an increase in population, so that part of the world, or Ireland, suffered least from the famine. And it's, in many ways, it's the flax growing areas, and some, or bulk of it's in flax growing areas, except perhaps Donegal. But once you went down south, they would never have been used to having such a level of frost in the winter time. The crops would have been, potato crop wiped out more there. And you get down to Kerry and that bottom, which Cork and Kerry were worst affected. And instead, Kerry lost a third of its population in that famine. And overall, Ireland, it said 1/6 of the population was lost. So it really was a tremendous setback to Ireland at the time. But after that, in a sense, the tide turns for agriculture and it becomes better, more prosperous. For the coincidence of a number of reasons. Well, one, around the 1750s or so, England tipped the balance and lost its self-sufficiency in food supply. I suppose the industrialisation was a bit ahead in England than it would in migration to towns and all that. So after 1750s or so, England realised it couldn't keep and sustain this ban on imports of food from Ireland. It repealed those laws I showed you at the start, stopping the export of wool, the export of cattle and foodstuffs to Ireland, into England from Ireland. And Ireland, as they became England's principal outside caterer, a state that exists still to this day, doesn't it? Sometime in the 50s, I saw reports of the Irish Parliament putting bounties, in other words, paying export subsidy, or whatever you like to call it, on exports of grain to England. Tillage expands and becomes much more important across Ireland, though it still has as a substantial livestock industry. Well, for example, in County Armagh, which incidentally was one of the most populated counties in Ireland through the century, in County Armagh, whereas here was Lennon and tillage, if you went up to Newton Hamilton, that whole area of Fuse, it retained its livestock superiority, or whatever you call it. It had large herds of cows, flocks of sheep, etc. It stayed as a livestock part of the country. But in the second half of the country, butter exports increased substantially. And let's just look at that there. That's just one example I came across by accident. Liverpool merchant selling Newry butter. The butter was exported in casks and barrels and exported in big quantities. Arthur Young says that he got statistics from Waterford Port. In 1775, Waterford exported 60,000 barrels of butter, 100 weight in each barrel. So that's 3,000 tonne of butter going through just Waterford alone. It was a big trade. And it made me think too and remind, you know, when they talk about the diet of the Irish going, the cottars and all that going up to the famine, it was spuds and what else? Buttermilk. Buttermilk. So everybody was probably making butter from the milk they had. And therefore the buttermilk being that bit sour would have preserved a bit longer and kept a bit longer for them. But it meant, yes, it must have been right across the country there was the trade in butter. Of course, you heard them talking there about the cottars eating with the pigs and the pigs living with them. I did come across a report of a man who was travelling through Carlingford, as they say, in the 1750s. He said the accommodation he found was quite tolerable. As say, he slept in the kitchen, but in the morning the pigs made him leave. Apparently the main Irish pig was the Irish Greyhound pig, which must have had a bit of speed about it because it looked like the one on the left there. But they said when it got big enough and was ready to be fattened, it did actually fatten up quite well. Now, probably never actually got quite as good as the one on the right, but it did fatten up quite well. And not only that, you see this comment here from Captain James Cook, who found Australia, if you put it, found, and did all that travelling in the 1770s. The native Irish pig makes the best messed pork in the world. So Ireland did produce quality produce, agricultural produce, as I say, way back in those days. But even though, as I say, prosperity was coming to the farmers in that second half of 1700s, because of the need for England to import more food, there were still increasing financial pressures on the tenant farmers, because every farmer essentially was a tenant. There was certainly the rent to the landowner, but there was another level before that in the way they purchased the tenancy. And then there was the tithes to the Church of Ireland. The cess was local rates, and there was the hearth tax. If you had more than one hearth in the house, you had to pay a tax on all the extra ones. And a lot of information you get in the 1700s about populations comes actually from the records on hearth tax. Ulster in that time, as I say, was better off than the rest of Ireland, because with the planters came in an agreement sort of between the landowners and the tenants for a greater level of tenure of the lease of the tenancy. And this is just to illustrate that is the terms of a lease from a Lord Wells to Joseph Dixon, Donaldsmore 1783. You see the duration there. Standard tenancy then in Ulster, and it was called the Ulster tradition or the Ulster issue, was 3 lives. When you made the tenancy, you put the names of 3 people on the leasehold document, and that tenancy survived for the lives of all 3 people. So here, Joseph Dixon put himself and his 2 sons as the 3 lives. But for a Catholic, you weren't allowed to do that. The best you could do was have a lease for 31 years, or more likely 21 years, or perhaps even no tenure whatsoever. The rent was paid twicely. I see in that rent agreement was 13 shillings an acre, but then there was this other 6D for a per pound for a receiver's fee, and I'm not sure what that was. In addition, then, the agreement said you have to work for the landlord so many days in the year. And this one also said the tenant has to build a dwelling house at his own cost, plus enclosures. What you see today of our landscape, with all its hedges and everything else, is the product of the 1700s. And that sort of rental agreement. Enclosures. In this instance, as I say, the tenant had to make 30 purchase of ditch with a hedge per year. And the ditch had to be 5 foot wide and 4 foot deep. So when you see all the labour that went into making hedges around there, it came with this type of agreement between the landlord and the tenant. And that would have been agreement about enclosure was right out across Ireland. In this case, as say Donaldsmore, he had to plant an orchard as well, 1 acre of apple trees, and common. If the landlord owned a mill, a corn mill, he had to grind his corn at the landlord's mill. Of course, the landlord retained rights, all the minerals, the lime rights, because of the people, they liked lime, or they knew the value of lime so much. Maybe Frank can tell us, but I assume the likes of that lime kiln that's at Gamble's Bridge would have been built in the 1700s, because any source of lime in the countryside was greatly prized. There was the hunting, hawking, fishing, and fowling. I'll note this last one, I'll come back to it in a minute, make roads through their property. But as I said, that's the basis of why we have fields today with hedges around them. And it's interesting, Arthur Young in his passage around Ireland specified exactly how you find a hedge in your field today. He said a bank was made faced with a single layer of stone, and the thorn quicks were planted in among the stones. So and that's exactly how we find them today. So when you look at your hedges, as I say, they are, 100 years old, and it's no wonder that by now they're looking a bit careworn in places. But the other aspect of, as I say, the pressures on, say, the tenant farmer with the tithes. Normally 1/10 of the produce of the land to be paid for maintenance of the Church of Ireland. It was sort of codified quite a bit in that there was just, instead of looking at your accounts and seeing taking a tenth, it was so much a milk cow, so much a sheep, etc. It was agreed that way. That's 1751 in Ardstraw, County Tyrone. But it was, tithes were hated. Maybe it's bad enough, as I say, the Church of Ireland person paying tithes to the church, but the Presbyterians and the Catholics hated it. And it was hated for 2 reasons. One, the tithe owner wasn't the person collecting the tithes. You know, if you think where County Armagh, here you be in the diocese of the Bishop of Armagh, do you think the Bishop of Armagh was going to come out around collecting the tithes of every farmer? No way. So all the tithe owners then sold the right to collect the tithes to somebody with local knowledge. If, for example, it was likely, say, that the sum of tithes was, say, £500, what do you expect to collect from this area? Maybe sold for £450 to a tithe proctor who might have been a big farmer and knew all the farms and who owned what around it. But then, when he went to the farmer, he was looking sums of money that at the very minimum added up to £600. Or even much more extortionate than that. I saw in Cork, it was said that a tithe of a sum of £150, when it got to the farmer, they were looking £600. It was that business of a middleman taking their whack and it being so divorced from the people to whom, as I say, the tithes were actually going, that it created a lot of dislike. The other one was the cess, the local rates. The farmers had to pay for the upkeep of roads. Farmers, as opposed to local traders. When you started the 1700s, there had only been the main roads, the likes of the Belfast Road, the great road between Belfast and Newry. There were none of the side roads, and the landlords were taking it upon themselves to get the side roads made. The procedure for that was at the end of the assizes, the criminal assizes, the quarterly assizes, whoever the jury was there, at the end they made decisions. You made an application to them for permission to build a road. So the landlord thought that he wanted a road through his territory. He wrote out a case, presented it to the juries. They assessed it, and if they said yes, he had 6 months to come back to them showing that the road had been made. But once the road was made, the cost was then put onto his tenants. So the landowner, the Lord didn't pay for it at all. It was the tenants all the time who ended up paying for it. And these sort of pressures ultimately led to the basis of agrarian unrest. It really started with levellers, people who objected to the common land being enclosed and hedged and all that by the 1750s, and escalated through the second half of the 1700s. The Hearts of Steel, who were entirely Presbyterians, causing mayhem through the countryside. I list them all there. It ended up, became sectarian defenders, Orangemen's, Peabody Days Boys, and the 98 Rebellion. So while there was more prosperity in the end of the century, ultimately the agrarian unrest really soured a lot of it and spurred all that unrest, spurred some of that immigration from the Presbyterians that I talked to you about there a moment or two ago. But I'm going to leave you with Arthur Young's comment about the Irish character. He said, the manners, character and customs among the rich are pretty much the same everywhere. It is among the common people that you see the national character. The circumstances that struck me most in the Irish are vivacity and a great and eloquent volubility of speech. One would think they could take snuff and talk without tiring till doomsday. They are infinitely more cheerful and lively than anything we commonly see in England. Nothing of that sullen silence in which Englishmen wrap themselves. Well, that's a good point. However, lazy to an excess at work, but so spiritedly active at play, that at hurling, which is the cricket for savages, they show the greatest feats of agility. Warm friends and revengeful enemies, hard drinkers and quarrelsome, great liars, but civil, submissive and obedient. They also have a great love of dancing. So I leave you to assess where you fit into that description. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy. It was very entertaining. So it's good to see that some farming practices have changed over the years. I'd like to go out with a scythe or a spade now to a few farmers to see how they'd get on with it.
Sorry, one thing I forgot about, there's a few examples of the equipment here, and perhaps someone here can tell me exactly what that was used for, and tell me that they have seen it in use. Well done, sir. Absolutely right. Hmm? Okay. Well, sir, the gentleman who, have you seen it working? Hmm? Right, come on up here and explain how you work it then. You see it as a needle at the pointed end. And you threw the ropes out round the stack and then over the top. You're quite right, sir. You are quite right. That is called a needle. I would say it goes back to the 1700s, that. Yes. Well, that is why I say the likes of this were last used in the 50s, and it's only the people old enough to have been in the farm in the 50s who would have seen these things working. And they're the last people ever that will ever have seen these here working. And this here, you know what this is? Exactly. Well, in the photographs I showed you, the harness and around the shoulders of the horse was leather and all that. But away back in the 1700s, it would have been made of rope of straw. Several ropes of straw tied together, plaited together. So yes, that could well there go back to the 1700s as well. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Roy. I suppose it was very interesting to see even just where some of our place names come from in terms of the linen industry, and Linen Hall Square or Bleach Green or different names like that we see throughout local towns and local areas. So thank you very much again, Roy. I'm just wondering if anyone has anything they want to add to Roy's talk, or to ask him any questions or anything of interest.
I would like to ask one thing. You see a lot of primroses around the hedgerows and bluebells. Were they part of the seeding, or what was the reason?
Pass. I don't know. I did not come across any reference to planting flowers or bluebells or anything in the hedgerows. So, you do see them, yes. Is it because the shade? Well, the bluebells need shade, and it might just be because there's the right environment there for them to thrive. The crocuses, you would say, are they not all introductions long after the 1700s? Oh, the primrose. Oh, yes, the primrose. Again, I would say it's the same. It's the need for shade. And I can't remember. I know, yes, I see them around home and the base of the hedges, yes.
Lots of hedges have them, so just wondered if there was any, was this that was required, maybe for bees or something at the time?
I don't know. To me, I would have thought there's a need for, in the primroses, a drier soil in the base of a hedge and a need for shade.
Bluebells are normally associated with ancient woodlands.
Yes, yes.
That's the sign of an ancient woodland area.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.